we dive into the presentation, I just briefly want to go over the house rules for the webinar. So during the presentations, which will last half an hour, into the talk for 10 minutes, there will be some noises during that presentation. These are to alert the presenters of the time constraints, and so you can just ignore them. After the presentations, we will have approximately half an hour for questions. Thank you very, very much for those of you who submitted questions in advance. We have selected some of these questions for the Q&A session. If you have questions during the presentation, please enter these into the chat box. We will direct these to the presenters if we have time during the Q&A session. And with that, let's dive into the first presentation with Rukmini Banerjee, who will present on the Teaching at the Right Level approach. Over to you, Rukmini.
Yeah, hi everyone. This is Rukmini. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. We've been having some technology issues at this end. Just a quick thing, Radhika, I don't think from our end we are able to control the PowerPoint. So either you just go ahead or let us know what to do. But since everybody has the material, I think I'll just start. Yep. Is that okay?
Yes, Degani, I think you have control now if you want to try moving through the slides.
Yes, thank you.
Perfect.
So we've been given 10 minutes to tell you what we've been doing for 20 years. So let's see if we are able to do that sufficiently to get you interested in wanting to do this yourself. Okay. I've tried to keep it at just 10 things we want to say, and hopefully some of the questions to any of us on the panel will help. So very quickly, the problem is well known, so I don't think we need to dwell too much on that. In India, like in many other places, almost everyone is in school, or very large numbers of kids are in school, but clearly we have a problem with learning. And you know, this we've given you some idea of what the level of the problem is in India, that at least half the children, even after they get to 5 years of school, are still unable to do some of the basic stuff, and similarly with arithmetic. Reasons for this, many theories, people have different views. The way we've been looking at it is, I think, along the lines of what Lance Pritchett calls over-ambitious, negative consequences of over-ambitious curriculum. That we have, you know, like with many other countries, we have a very linear age grade set of curricular expectations from children as they move through the school system. And so by the time you get to whatever, second grade or third grade, the assumption is that the kids have mastered whatever it is that they should have learned in those years. And so the teacher then teaches from what she's expecting the children to know, rather than from the children, where the children are. And the end result is, I think, what we see. I think Abhijit and Esther call it teaching to the top of the class, and you know, different people call it by different names. But it leaves behind a massive numbers of kids who are not able to do even the basics, despite being in school. And I think the problem in India, probably other places as well, that many parents of children who are in school today don't have much schooling themselves, so they can't really help the kids. Very quickly, just to look at concrete dimensions of the problem, I've pulled out the latest ASR report, 2016, which gives us a very large sample of kids, and I think is able to show us the problem in a kind of a very clear way. So if you look at this table, and if we just look at grade 5, you'll see that about half, 47.8% of kids are able to read the highest level that we have in the ASR test, which is a grade 2 level text. So, you know, we know that there are at least half the kids who are able to do basic things, but the other half is really the set of kids that we are concerned about. And you can see that it's not only a low level, but that the tail of the distribution is quite long. So even in 5th grade, among those who can't read, we have a big amount of variation. And so really the challenge for the teacher who's standing in front of the class with the 5th grade textbook, which is far, far higher than this, is that who should she direct her attention to and what should she teach the kids that she decides to teach. And I think that is one of the reasons that we see the situation as it is, because teachers will then decide to do what the textbook thinks she ought to be doing, and that will only reach some percentage of the kids who are in my top half. And those are the kids who are going to move ahead. So this is just a concrete illustration of the problem that we are handling. Over the years, I think looking at the situation, what we've evolved is now being called teaching at the right level. Somebody asked me some time ago, what is the right level? And I said that right level is a level at which the child is. So if you start from where the child is and then move towards where you think the child ought to be, that is really the strategy that seems to be working for us. So regardless of age or grade, we start from the level of the child, and the way we define the level of the child is really, if you look at the column headings on my third slide, just the previous slide, you can see that at least for the language or for reading, it's useful for us to categorize our kids into those 5 levels: those who can't read any letters at all, those who can read letters but not words, those who can read words but not yet sentences, and so on. And we know that that's where the kids are. And substantial numbers of kids, even in 4th or 5th grade, are at these different levels. So starting from that level, focusing on some of the basic foundational skills, reading, obviously with understanding, being able to express their own views, and some of the foundational building blocks in arithmetic, that's really what teaching at the right level is. And we'll spend just a few minutes kind of going through the key elements of those. So the first element starts with, how do I know my children? Simple assessment. You see a Hindi version of it here. In India, we do it in whatever the medium of instruction may be, to try and figure out very quickly, one-on-one with each child, where the child is comfortably at today. Then we group the children based on these basic levels, and depending on the number of teachers or instructors that are available, we allocate them to the different groups. Then for each group, we have a set of activities that we will not discuss today. Perhaps there will be a different webinar to go through that. But we know that there are some common activities that kids can do, such as listening to a story. But then when we go into decoding activities, different groups need a different level of activities, a different intensity. So kids work in groups. They also do things as individuals. And as the intervention progresses, we use a similar assessment to just keep track of what progress the kids are making. Just very quickly, I don't want to spend much time because I think that's probably the subject of a much longer discussion. The key activities that we do in language and in math, we put them down here. Some reading, a lot of talk, discussion. The Indian languages have a very nice phonetic structure, so we have some phonetic charts on which we do chart-related activities, a lot of oral word games. And through this whole process, even for basically focusing on reading, we find that talking and writing are both work very well to sort of build the overall language capability. The math one, again, a lot of talk, simple activities with counting, using of some number charts, and then operations which are done really with some concrete objects. So I'm deliberately not going into the teaching learning part because I think that can be discussed in a later webinar. Moving to how is this solution actually done on the ground, we have 2 main models with which we work. One that we are calling our direct work, and the form that the direct work takes are these learning camps. The other model is when we work with the government. And on this slide, what we've tried to do is to give you kind of a broad overview of what is similar and what is different across these models. So our main work, our biggest work is done with kids who are in grades from 3 to 5, who are grouped by level and not by grade. And during the school day, some time is allocated, usually at least 2 hours, during the normal school day to work on this. When we work directly, it is a Pratham person who leads the activities and is supported by volunteers or by teachers. And we've worked out over a period of time and with evaluations helping to bring evidence about the effectiveness, that if you work in a camp mode, we usually do 8 to 10 days of intensive activity of this type. Then there is some gap time, and then we come back some days later and conduct a similar camp. And somewhere between 3 to 5 camps of this type, total number of days being either 30 to 50, we see significant improvement in children's learning. And interestingly, we've tried it without gaps and we've tried with gaps, and the ones with gaps actually have higher results. And perhaps we can have a discussion on that later. When we work with the government, then the actual instruction is done by the school teachers. They are supported by officials who are above the school level, and we make sure wherever possible that those officials themselves have carried out at least 15 to 20 days of working with children themselves daily, so that they know what the nuances are, the nuts and bolts are of what the teachers will need. And in an ideal situation, these people who have done it themselves then lead the teachers through the entire process, so that it's a self-contained activity and the system itself can provide the inputs that the schools need. In both cases, we need to have a daily activity time which is set aside. And of all the models that we've done with governments, it usually lasted a period of 60 to 80 days for a whole variety of other reasons. But I think this could easily be, depending on the baseline, it could be a part of the school year for at least 4 to 5 months, at least in India, to reach the kinds of results that we do. I hear a lot of bells, so I think we should go through very quickly what we are saying. The next 2 slides are really to show you the kinds of results we have, both of which have also been evaluated, and I'm sure JPAL will talk about those. Substantial and significant improvement in both types of models can be seen. And, the current slide, slide number 8, shows you the kinds of results we've been able to achieve with over 200,000 children last year. And the slide number 9 gives you an example from one of the states in which we have worked last year, again with substantial numbers of kids. I think this is almost 75,000 kids, in which even in a period of 60 days, you see reading levels going from 40% all the way up to 75%, and big jumps also in arithmetic. We don't have time to talk about it today, but we have done some tracking of children in years after they've finished all this, and we find that there's a substantial amount of durability of these basic foundational skills that they get. So just to wind up, just key things that we want people to remember is that these kids who are in school are often invisible. And so it's important that assessments like USR or other things are done to actually bring out the fact that lots of kids are getting left behind even in early years. We know that just doing more of the same will not lead to significant gains. And so we found that a very clear set of goals, some kinds of very simple assessment to make the problem visible, these both help to gain attention for this very important problem, and then a new strategy is needed. Second point is that we found that the basic skills, reading and basic math, you work on those. Often we have governments who say we need to work on a whole variety of skills simultaneously, but we found that using some of these 2 or 3 basic building blocks, working on those and starting from where the child is, has proven to be very useful for us. And the third thing is that we find that when kids have been in school for a couple of years, they are also much more ready to pick up the kinds of capabilities that we are trying to build. And acceleration is much more easily possible for kids who are 7 and 8 and older, because I think they're developmentally more ready. So I just want to end with the fact that this is a big problem. In a big country like India, it's a huge problem. But the solution that we've come up with we feel is quite easy to implement if people recognize the problem and are willing to work on it. And therefore, of all the problems that we face, this one, I think, has solutions. To me, this is, low-hanging fruit. And, if we in a complicated and chaotic country like India have been able to make good headway, surely people who are in simpler situations should be able to do better.
So just to wrap up, to let you all know that you can visit the Pratham website or the ASER website for more information on TaRL or the ASER assessment. And we hope by later on today in the day, maybe by around 5 p.m. Eastern time, we should be available with a list of documents on teaching at the right level that you should be able to access on the Pratham homepage. You will see a tab called Docs on the right side of the pratham.org page in a few hours. And here is some more information that you could see on YouTube, etc., about teaching at the right level.
Okay, thank you so much, Devyani and Rukmini, for that really informative presentation. I think now we can hand over to Annie Duflo, who will present on the Teacher Community Assistant Initiative. Annie, over to you.
Hi, everyone. This is Annie with IPA. As Rukmini said, several of Pratham programs have been rigorously evaluated by JPAL, and because the evidence was so positive, and because the problems described by Rukmini are quite similar in many countries, we decided to take this concept to Ghana, where IPA has a large country office. I haven't yet been able to get to the slides, I think, but they will probably come up in a few minutes. So I'll continue. I was particularly excited to work on this because I actually worked with Pratham many years ago. It was one of my first jobs, so it was an exciting experience. So IPA colleagues and I shared this result from India with the Ghana Education Service and with other education players. And together we agreed to work on adapting these ideas to the Indian context, to the Ghanaian context. Here we go. So as our goal was to implement, to adapt a demonstrated approach to a new context with a view to scale, we first had to understand the context. What was similar about it and what was different? How could the targeting instruction at the right level concept be adapted, but at the same time not lost in translation? So first, we knew that the problem was similar in Ghana, so that was the first thing. On the other hand, in Ghana, there isn't a large organization like Pratham. Really, the organization with scale on education is the government, so it had to be a fully government-run program. It turns out that Ghana had a youth employment program run by the Ministry of Youth and Sports, through which they recruit young people with secondary school degrees for a couple of years and give them a job and a stipend. So this provided with an opportunity to recruit community tutors to provide support in school, and this also provided an opportunity to make this approach financially feasible. So in order to support this initiative, we organized an exposure trip to India to visit the Pratham program. So you can see here some Ghanaian government officials and teacher union officials meeting with the Pratham team. We put together a steering committee that brought together the different players from the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Youth and Sport, IPA, and others, and worked on adapting this concept to the Ghanaian context. And as we did that, some questions came up. For example, if using teacher assistants recruiting them through the youth employment program to provide remedial classes to the lowest performing students in the class. When should this remedial class take place? Should it happen during school hours, after school hours? And if it's during school hours, will it hurt the kids because they don't attend the main class? If it's after school, will they really come? Is it really about targeted instruction? Can't we just add an assistant? And most importantly, the ministry was really interested in the question of, do we really need assistants? So they were worried that the youth employment program may not last. So their question was, can we instead train teachers to do this? So in order to test these questions, we set up a nationwide randomized control trials to test 4 different variations of this approach. The intervention was going to be targeted at children in grades 1 to 3, and the evaluation took place between 2010 and 13. So in the first variation of that was tested, assistants, we call them teacher community assistants, or TCAs, so I will use this word going forward. TCAs were recruited through the youth employment program and were posted in schools near where they live. So they were supposed to identify the lowest performing students using the simple assessment that Rukmini described, and then to teach them the basic skills a couple of hours each day, separately from the rest of the class. And then in the second intervention, it was basically the same thing, except that the remedial class would take place after school. In the third intervention, assistants were posted in school, but there was no targeted instruction at the right level. So the government wanted to understand whether just adding a resource is important. And then in the fourth version of the program that was tested, there were no TCAs, assistants. This was teacher-led targeted instruction. And I'm going to zoom in on this a little bit. Because the intervention actually, the design of this intervention kind of evolved during the evaluation. At first, the teachers were asked to split their students in ability-based groups within their class. But it seemed a little bit challenging because they still had to teach kids at varying levels in their class. So in that sense, the problem didn't really disappear. So we then moved to another version of this, which is similar to what Rukmini described, where teachers from grade 1 to 3 for 1 hour a day were supposed to split their kids by ability levels rather than by grades. So I'm going to now talk about the results. I'm going to focus on the students who were in the study since the beginning. So later on, we added some new cohorts, as you know, kids who were starting in grade 1. But I'm going to focus on the ones who were with us from the beginning. So when the study started, they were in grade 2 and in grade 1. And it was the end of the year. So that's the green is when they were in the intervention. So when the end line took place in 2013, they were in grade 4 and in grade 3. So the grade 4 students had actually not been benefiting from this intervention for a year. So let me give you a high-level summary of the results. So we find positive effects of targeting instruction at the right level, especially when it was led by assistants, whether it was before or during school hours. Interestingly, the effects seem to persist because, as I said, the grade 4 students had not been benefiting from targeted instruction for a year, and yet the effects are almost similar for them. Whether it's during or after school hours, overall the impacts are almost similar, a bit higher for during school hours, but most importantly, it kind of seems to depend on the school context, and I'll get back to that. We also see some effects for the teacher-led targeted instruction, but they are lower and they were concentrated in literacy. And I think that's because, you know, at the time there was a huge focus on literacy in Ghana, so and on local language specifically. So it actually makes sense that the teachers focused on that. And the main reason why the teachers had a smaller impact was because they were doing this less often than the assistants. Two things I'd like to say. So first, I won't go through the impact in detail, but the testing tool that we used covered several sections of the curriculum, including things that, like geometry or grammar. And really the training that the teachers and the assistants received was focusing on the basic skills, like Rukmini described. And when you look at the impact on these basic skills, especially reading skills, the impacts are much higher. The test scores increased by 18% or so, and for the teacher-led model as well. So I think for, when thinking about teacher-led or assistant-led, there are a couple of key considerations. One is there an existing mechanism to recruit assistants? If there is a national service scheme or youth employment program, then this can provide an opportunity to bring in assistants to help with this model. If not, I think it's really important to give teachers the mandate and the space to do targeted instruction. There should be a dedicated time, or they should be like more of a camp model where the first few weeks of each term maybe is dedicated to just doing catch up by ability levels. And the other very important thing is mentoring and monitoring and looking at the role of school supervisors. And the thing that Rukmini described, like making sure that the school supervisors actually do it themselves, I think is really important, and that didn't happen so much in Ghana. In terms of during or after school hours, which was another variation of the program, like I said, it seems to depend on the school context. So I think, as a decision maker, I would say that, well, let the school decide depending on their context. So in schools that didn't have extra space, the program seemed to work better after school. In schools with multi-grade teaching, and it happens in 20% of schools in Ghana, the program worked actually much better overall, but even better during school hours. And it kind of makes sense because in multi-grade classes, the levels vary even more than in single grade classes. So I'll wrap up because my time is over. But I think in terms of which model to implement, I think it's really looking at what will provide us the highest likelihood that the program will be implemented with the highest intensity, and based on that, I think deciding on the structure of the program. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. I mean, that was really interesting. I'm going to hand over now to John.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ashley, and it's very nice to have the opportunity to be here. So JPAL has, similar with IPA, has been involved in evaluations in education programs throughout the world. So at the moment, there's been over 200 completed or ongoing education studies in 43 countries. And just to build off what Rukmini was saying, a lot of these programs are focusing on ways to increase basic numeracy and literacy. And so I'm trying to zoom out and put some of the results that Annie shared as well as Rukmini in a broader context. And when we're thinking about where this type of model might be effective, we should think about where there are similar problems of low learning levels and large heterogeneity in the classroom. One of the big contributions that Pratham has made has actually been on its citizen-led survey, the annual Status of Education report, which, as Rukmini said, showed that half of kids in grade 5 in India can't read a grade 2 text. But that's not a problem unique to India. So in other citizen-led assessments in Pakistan, UASO has done wonderful work in East Africa. There's been work in Mali and Senegal and Mexico. Shows that kids, even by the time they get to grades 3, 4, and 5, are several years behind grade level in numeracy and literacy, and that's something we see reflected in the international exams as well. So one very natural place to start is a lot of international development programs and foundation programs. When you walk into a classroom in many developing countries, you'll see that several kids are sharing one textbook. The classrooms themselves don't have a lot of equipment. So there's been a lot of initial focus on adding additional school-level inputs, from textbooks to flip charts, libraries, giving block grants to schools, decreasing the student-teacher ratio, doubling teacher pay. You can all think about these as different types of inputs. And in general, inputs alone haven't, in randomized control trials that have been conducted, haven't been shown to increase learning outcomes. And just reflecting on why that might be the case, if we go look at the third bullet here, is it just suggests that there's other binding constraints in addition to inputs. And one thing that we do see across contexts and good descriptive work is these huge variation of learning levels across grades, or even within grades, excuse me, that many schools are set up with a curriculum that is more advanced than the level of the children. And teachers just are not incentivized, but don't have space to teach to all levels in the classroom. And it's very natural to target instruction to the levels of the highest performing children who are most likely to be at grade level. So I won't get into the details of the teaching at the right level model that both Rukmini explained in India and also Annie touched on and how it was adapted to Ghana. But I will say that just in the context of the types of programs from these 200 evaluations that have been shown to be more effective, one subset of interventions is around school governance. A second is around pedagogy, so changing the teacher learning equation in the classroom. And putting this evidence even beyond, Pratham has originated the teaching at the right level model, and Pratham and IPA and JPAL have been working very carefully to help transfer that model to other places like Ghana and Zambia and now Peru. But there's a broader set of evidence looking at similar types of supplementary remedial education models in India and Kenya, Chile, the U.S., recently an education technology program in India that have shown also very promising results. I think we can be confident that these types of supplementary remedial education programs, there's a broad base beyond Pratham that they can be effective. So that and for me, that gives me greater confidence in the model. Now, this model, another special thing about Pratham is that as part of their overall learning and research and development strategy, they've incorporated rigorous evaluations such as randomized control trials. I will try to give a couple of the takeaways in the development of the model, partnering together with two JPAL directors, Abhijit Banerjee, Esther Duflo, and co-authors. And over a period of 13 years, there were 6 RCTs that helped to evolve the model by Pratham, incorporating the learning into the next round. And so I won't have time to dive into detail, but I just want to give a highlight of how the development of the model over time, because I think it is useful to thinking about how it can be applied. So in the proof of concept stage, there was evidence that local volunteers, local tutors and volunteers could deliver the model. And both, an in-school model where the lower performers were taken out of the class, as well as a model that was run after school. One of the things that we think about is that for an out-of-school model, as Annie put her finger on, is take-up. So what percentage of the kids are able to attend these classes if they're happening out of school? And then there's, a potential challenge if you're going to run an in-school model of volunteers is that you have to have a very good recruitment and retention strategy to have volunteers or community assistants in school throughout the year. Annie's point, if there's a national service that can be leveraged, is quite good. So after the proof of concept in 3 states, both rural and urban, and phase 2 is really looking at developing a model that could be scaled across India. One thing is, as Rukmini touched on, is these bursts or these camps. There was an evaluation that showed that government teachers after the school year were very effective in delivering a camp model, incorporating teaching at the right learning. But when we Pratham tried to work with government teachers during the government school day to implement the program in Uttarakhand state, teachers didn't implement the model during the school day. There was a lot of competition for time, and they defaulted to business as usual styles of teaching. So at phase 3, where we get to with 2 randomized evaluations, and this has been really pivotal in terms of Pratham's, IPA's, and JPAL's work after in terms of helping other governments to adopt the model. I think one level, as Rukmini said, was optimizing the camp model, so looking at, within that kids can learn and close the gap in 50 days in a school year. And then there's different ways to do that by 10-day bursts with some time off in between, or 20-day bursts. The second was that teachers, there's now good evidence that teachers can deliver the model during the school day, but to the point that both Rukmini and Annie made is that, number one, you need dedicated time. So in this particular state where there's a randomized control trial, they reserved the last hour of the day to implement teaching at the right level, and they rearranged kids in grade 3 through 5 based on their level. So they kind of grouped across grades. And the second is, I think this is true, and you see this from some of the TUSAME evaluations as well, that Ben Piper and RTI have been involved in Kenya, is just the role of having a mentor or monitor to support teachers in implementing an innovation. And so in India, where they were able to leverage this assistant block resource coordinator, roughly 15 per one school, or one coordinator, one mentor for 15 schools that were able to support the teachers. And so I won't have time to get into the details, but on the left was the teacher-led model, and you see, in one school year, 10 percentage point gains in the number of kids who could read a simple paragraph. In the right was the volunteer camp-led model, and then you can notice the kids start off at a much lower base, but they're able to make tremendous gains in 50 days. I'll argue that the one thing that's not shown here is this is a reflection of cost. So in the model on the left, because Pratham is supporting it, a number of schools and through one staff member, they don't need just 1 or 2 staff members per school like you do in the direct model. It's actually also very quite cost effective. So in the last minute, I'll just try to summarize a few of the key takeaways. When we're thinking about the assistants or the volunteers or the paid delivery model, they've been shown to be effective both in and outside the school day. There's a little bit different twists of the delivery model. So you could pull kids out during the school day. You could do an after-school type program, or short bursts in the mornings is what's been tried in different places of India, where a similar type of camp model. And the benefits is that it's easy to adopt in the sense that, the volunteers and the assistants it's easier usually to hold them, to train them on the model and to get them energized about delivering it. On the downside, you've got the challenge of doing ongoing recruitment and retention for this kind of extra force that's going into schools. The teacher-led model is, I think what we've seen from this is that just giving teachers the teaching at the right level material hasn't worked. Just giving the teachers the teaching at the right level material and training them also hasn't worked. But the importance of, I'm going to skip to the importance of basically finding time during the school day, a dedicated time or a camp, and then providing them this mentoring, monitoring support to help support them in changing practice. And a challenge to implement this is working with governments to be able to dedicate that time. And so there's a few last points on when to do the model, either if it's teacher-led or assistant or volunteer-led. If we're doing it after school, we just need to think about take-up, which is something that's very important. During schools is just how to dedicate that time. And the pull-out model is very interesting during the school day, but then it requires additional resources that we're providing into the school to be able to pull out kids. You need someone to be able to teach them, and that requires additional resources to come into schools. So I'll stop there. I'll just say that, a role that JPAL and IPA and Pratham have been all playing together is to share this research and part of the webinar today. And then we're really interested in working with partners, and in particular governments, who want to set up pilots of teaching at the right level programs, and not necessarily even involving an RCT. We think the evidence base over the last 15 years is strong enough where and we have enough operational models that is the program can be implemented as delivered. We're pretty confident about the learning gains that can come for basic numeracy and literacy. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present today.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you to the other presenters. Without wasting too much time, I'd like to move on to some questions. So I'm going to direct questions to particular presenters, and these are questions that came from the participants. So the first question is teaching at the right level effective for older grades, such as grade 4 to grade 6, and for younger grades, such as grade 1 and grade 2? I'm going to ask for responses from all of the presenters, but can I please have Rukmini first, Annie second, and John third? So if we can start with Rukmini's response to that question.
Yeah, so for older grades, we already do it for grades or 3 to 5. We've done a very similar approach with older kids, those who are in India, we call them in middle school, but grades 6 and upwards. The advantage of kids who are in grade 6 and upwards is that they pick up even faster, so it takes lesser time. The lower grades, 1 and 2, actually there isn't a lot of variation in their learning levels. Many of the kids in 1 and 2 are actually just at the beginner level. So therefore the grouping and so on doesn't need to be the way we do it for the grades 3 and above, because they're all pretty much at the beginner level. But it does help us in India to disregard, at least for that period, the required textbooks and curricular requirements and just focus on the basic skills that we want to build up. So variations for lower age groups are a different set of things to be considered. But for the older age groups, I think we've seen that it works quite well.
Great, thanks. Can we get a response from Annie, please?
Yeah, I don't have too much to add. So the intervention in Ghana focused on grade 1 to 3, but like Rukmini said, when we look at like scores in grade 1, like they are much more homogeneous than in grade 2 and grade 3. So I would definitely agree with that. I think it was much harder to figure out in which groups to put the grade 1 students. We have I focused on the students who were in the study from the beginning. So like I said, when they started the program, they were at the end of grade 1 and 2. So really the bulk of the intervention for them was when they were in grade 2 and 3 respectively. And we looked at impacts for the cohorts that came later, and we don't see a lot of impacts for them, but there might also be other reasons, like they were in the program for less long and we didn't have a baseline for them, so it's not entirely comparable. So. But I think the key is really what Rukmini said about heterogeneity.
And I'll just add to that, it's exactly the same problem, but in the other direction. When we think about older kids, you can expect that there's going to be even more heterogeneity than there is in grades 3 to 5. So if we look broader at different types of supplementary remedial education models, I believe some folks from Saga Innovations are on the line. They've worked in this matched tutoring program that was tested by an RCT in Chicago for high school boys in particular who were several years behind their level in math, or the expected level in math. And there it's much more intensive. It was 2-to-1 tutoring that was able to, so two boys with one tutor that was able to help close the gap. Pratham has also been at the forefront as well in looking at the role of education technology. So if you had good software, education technologies that allowed, it was adaptive, and so the kids get answers right, they get more difficult questions, and they get answers wrong, they get they get easier questions. That if there's that type of personalized learning that can take place by having kids interact with the computers, that also can help target instruction across greater heterogeneity of levels to the level of the learner, and might be an effective way to think about for kids when looking at the post-primary ages.
Great. The second question is, what are the biggest challenges you have experienced in trying to scale up teaching at the right level? Is the scaled version very different from the original, more controlled version? Rukmini, can we please have a response from you?
Yeah, so we are working, for the past few years with a whole variety of state governments in India. So I think right now we have something like 12 states with whom we work. And I think we've been fairly good at now identifying the key elements that we really think should be in place. Now, when we define these, and we can go through what those may be, but one of them is that the highest level decision makers realize that there's a problem and really want to do something about it. And then there are many other pieces, such as, you want a set of people who are going to lead the teachers, who do the practice themselves. You want to make sure that all the teaching learning material comes in time, and so on. So where we can feel that all the key elements are in place on time, we see very good results. The problem is that very often, at least in India, even though the highest decision maker within that state may decide that they want to do this, there are delays and disruptions of things that are sometimes out of their control. So I would say that, given, what should I say? I feel confident that when you have identified 4 or 5 key pieces, and the people who are designing the program are fully on sync with not only that these pieces are important, but they are to be aligned in the right sequence, then you can have pretty good results. But within the government system, not everything is in the control of those who are implementing your program. So it's kind of a mixed answer. After so many years of working, I really do think that it is worth continuing to really scale up with the government, because at least with every round of scaling up, we've learned something new. And I think that that's a key piece to kind of keep in mind, that these are all iterations, and you need to have a long-run view to know that you're going to come up with the best iteration within 2 years, and you're not going to have the best iteration the year you begin. So I don't know if this answers it, and I'm sure there are lots of people who are smiling, but this is the reality of how you work with others, especially the governments, when you're trying to scale up.
Great, thank you. Sorry, John,
oh, actually, yeah, can I just add one small point? Is that, I think that when we looked at the model in India that was done in the northwest state of Haryana, that was the government-led model, teacher-led model. I think to the point that Annie and Rukmini both made is that, the model is effective when implemented well, and I think when we did spot checks of the treatment group, so the group that was implementing, the schools that were implementing the program, that 92% of the time when we did a spot check, that were the kids grouped by age, not by age, but by learning level, and were they essentially implementing the program, then you do see the results. So 90% of the time that was happening in Haryana, and so then you see the results and learning gains. And so I think the question for scale, just to add to what Greenie is how can we actually support government teachers to implement the model? And I think we're confident that if it's implemented and implemented with intensity, then it'll drive results.
Yeah,
if I can add, sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'd like to say one more thing, that it's not just what are the challenges in scaling up, what are the challenges in the changes that you bring in enduring over a period of time. Now, the evaluations that have been done of our work mostly have been done, when you were implementing the program. In our direct programs, we've had some evaluations of what happens to track persistence. In India, though, we see that we don't have sort of rigorous evidence for this, but there's a state of Punjab, and this teaching at the right level was done there for a period of about 2.5 years, some years ago. Then there was completely the overall administration change, priorities changed. Nothing happened on those lines for at least 3 or 4 years. And then the government revived teaching at the right level in their own way. The year that they did that, the ASA results show improvement of about 10 or 15%, which to me was at least an indication of the fact that if people are allowed, if at the school level people are allowed to run interventions in the way that makes sense to them, there are things that endure over a period of time. Now, we don't have hard evidence for this, but I would say that from what we can gather, it is worth sort of following up on these kind of interventions several years afterwards, if the intervention has had 2 or 3 years to play out within its own system, so that there's enough institutional memory that allows these things to be absorbed.
Annie, do you have something you wanted to add?
No, I think this point has already been made, but I think one of the beauty of this approach is that this can be done without massive rehauling of the education system, which would be much more complicated. So this is not a change in curriculum. This is not like introducing a performance based incentive systems. But that said, in order to be implemented well, it does require some tweaks to like the normal classroom day. So tweaks in the timetable, or tweaks in the calendar year if it's more like a camp model. So there needs to be willingness to introduce some of these tweaks so that, as we emphasized, the teachers have the space to do this targeted instruction.
Great. We also got a lot of questions around cost. So the question is, what are the cost implications of the different models, and which model is most cost effective? In the interest of time, can we have responses from John and Annie for this one? John, you can go first.
So the costs are relatively inexpensive, and so I should say that where we've done cost-effective analysis, so when we've looked at learning gains and standardized them, and then we looked at them, learning gains as a ratio of the cost of the intervention, teaching at the right level is among the most cost-effective ways to increase basic numeracy and literacy of any program that we've tested, that we have cost data for. And I think that essentially you're looking at the costs of training, of the interactive material that's used is very inexpensive, and then the costs of setting up a monitoring system to making sure the program is run well. And it's in the volunteer model, there might be costs of transportation or stipends and to get the volunteers or the assistants, the tutors into the school. So that is relatively more costly. But then you often see larger gains in learning if that's something that can be done, just because to motivate and to focus on the training for folks outside the system has generally been seen to show bigger gains. But on the other hand, doing it with the school system, within the school system, focusing not only on the government teachers and training them, but also on training, the mentor and monitors that are already part of the system, you may not see as large of gains in terms of learning, but it can be done at a fraction of the cost because the human resources you're putting into are much fewer. So I think those are some of the trade-offs, but for both models, the teacher-led with government monitoring support and the volunteer assistant-led, they're among the most cost-effective models of studies that we've seen from randomized control trials that include cost data on the interventions.
So just to dive into the cost effectiveness of different potential models, I think it depends a little bit on the context. So in Ghana, we find that the assistant version was more cost effective because the impacts were higher. Like I said, because they were doing it more often than the teachers. But that's also because there was already a mechanism to recruit them, so they were already there and already paid for. So if you're going to add tutors or assistants and pay them, then of course that would be the main cost driver probably.
Okay, great. Thank you both. So I think in the last few minutes, I'm going to take one question from the chat window, which would be great to get all of your responses for, and then we can wrap up. So the question says, after many years of experience and research and lots of lessons on what does and doesn't work, what are the outstanding big questions that you think are critical to maxing or tapping into more impact? So if we can have responses from Rukmini first, Annie second, and John last, please.
It's a very big question. I think that to me a big challenge remains the fact that this problem, which is so pervasive, is so invisible. And at least from our experience, the more you can do to make this problem be felt firsthand, the more urgently people then seek a solution. We face a lot of resistance because a lot of people don't realize how big this problem is and how much it is blocking any future educational progress, or how much it is blocking the returns that you can get from the investments that you're already putting in. And the simple assessment that we do often helps to get to that aha moment, which then spurs you to look for solutions to it. So, I mean, I don't know if I'm interpreting the comment correctly, but the biggest challenge, I think, is to make more people really feel the urgency of the problem on hand, that you're keeping kids in school for 5 years, 8 years, and if they don't get enough value in return, you're actually sabotaging all your efforts for progress. So again, I'm not sure I understood the comment clearly, but I mean, what I said is an important thing anyway.
Thanks, Rukmini. Annie, can we have the response from you, please?
I'll focus on, I think, the follow-up questions that I think came out of this work in Ghana. So introducing innovations in the government system and in government schools is quite challenging, and I think that like Rukmini emphasized, the role of the school supervisors is really important, so I think more research needs to be done, more experimentation needs to be done with school supervisors, understanding what are sustainable ways to make them more effective, not just monitors but mentors of teachers. So I think that's an important area of research, how to enable school supervisors to be able to embrace innovation and to then in turn enable and motivate their teachers. There are lots of experiments focusing directly on the teachers, so I think that's an important research area, or experimentation area.
One of the areas that I'm very interested in is that, that I completely agree that with Annie that's a very exciting area for new research, and when we look particularly at post-primary, there's plenty of opportunities for more research on effective programs to increase learning and participation for that matter. I think one thing I'm very interested in is just, you know, from the evidence base that we have so far, which is quite strong, particularly in primary, is how do we integrate innovation and evidence into school systems? And it could be, you know, just doesn't need to be randomized control trial evidence. It could be just good evidence from accurate monitoring of outcomes, learning levels, and how those used to set targets and how they're tracked over time and inform decision making. I don't think that's actually happening in many places. And I do think then, you know, how can research organizations like IPA or like JPAL be effective in sharing evidence from rigorous research, and then also working with governments and partners who are some of the original innovators like Pratham to contextualize existing evidence for, you know, in a new place, and then set up pilots that are informed by local context, but also kind of informed by this global evidence. And there's been some progress on that in the last 5 years, but that is something I'm really excited to see. There's happening in a few places. IPA works closely with JPAL in Peru, and there's a lab, a Ministry of Education lab that's been set up there. There's been a lot of work with IPA, Pratham, and JPAL in Zambia around teaching at the right level. So this idea about how do we kind of take the evidence base we have, contextualize it for local areas, and then work with government hand in hand to match the global evidence base to their local issues, I think is going to be a huge determinant of how useful all of this research is in improving education.
Thanks so much, John. So we've run a few minutes over, and I'm going to end there. But before I end, I just want to say thank you so much to the presenters and to all of you who listened in today. We really hope that this webinar series is a useful one and that you continue to join the future webinars. As we mentioned, the next webinar will be a more in-depth look at the assessment component of teaching at the right level, and we will circulate more details on that webinar soon. So thank you very, very much to everyone, and have a great rest of the day.